Hello and welcome to another History of Japan learning stream. Last time we got deep into the Muromachi period, but today we're gonna finish it. We have one more video from the great channel Byuden, and yeah, it's really like basically the end of the Muromachi period, just before the big stuff. I think probably like maybe the most well-known period of Japanese history, the Sengoku Jidai, which at first my plan was to do a single 3-hour video by Kings and General, but last time Lobik suggested I do videos by the Shogunate, which goes much more in depth, not only on the battles, but the political situation and, you know, everything important. So I cooked up a playlist with 85 videos, and I think it's, how many? Let me see. Yeah, the majority of them is about the Sengoku Jidai, but then I've got also a lot of videos about the different clans that the Shogunate has done. So yeah, you know, it's going to be an even more extensive coverage of the Sengoku Jidai that I planned to do at first. But again, it's a period that I know a lot, and yet not too much. A lot of scattered knowledge and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm definitely thinking this is going to be good to really do it in depth, to really get to know everything. And this is a complete series as well. You know, I would have loved to continue with Byuden, but I think they only have one video yet for the Sengoku Jidai. Maybe we'll come back one day to watch the rest. But yeah, starting next time, I guess we're done with Byuden, and I guess we'll go Sengoku Jidai with Shogunate. And after that, maybe more Shogunate, because they also have like Edo videos, except they're not finished, but I did not find anything better on YouTube so far, so I guess we'll do their videos, and depending on where they end, maybe we'll try to find more videos to complete, or I'll go to Wikipedia. I guess we'll have to see. But yeah, today we're just doing a short 1-hour video finishing the Muromachi period. It might touch a little bit on what the Shogunate video will touch on with the Sengoku Jidai, which is why I might skip a bit around in this Byuden video. For example, I think it will probably finish with the Onin War, and I think the Onin War will be talked about in the Shogunate video. So I might skip it, so we can keep it for when we do the Sengoku stream, which will probably be next week. Well, the first one at least, as it might take a couple streams. But yeah, that's really the plan. So link for today's video is in the description. And once again, just want to say, I mean, not that, you know, you might watch this, but thank you to the channel Byuden Japanese History. It's been really interesting to learn, sorry about that, to learn, you know, most of the early period from Jomon to Muromachi. I mean, it's been pretty great. I learned a lot, and I've really loved their presentation style. Both, you know, the fact that they used Japanese textbook, but also, I don't know, the narration, the style of writing, the explanation has been very easy to follow. There's a lot of history channels that tend to be a bit more, you know, I tend to be very picky about history channel. I've told you guys many times. I really, for example, have a hard time with like the more comedic channel. That's why I don't really like oversimplify too much. And in general, I don't really enjoy the animated kind of hand-drawn one. You know what I mean? I prefer the one that use like historical art and stuff like that. Should give me a second. I'm trying to get this open, but I can't. This is annoying me. I'm gonna space it. Here we go. So yeah, so link for the video by Byuden, link to my Discord if you want to follow me, my stream element Patreon where you can support me. If you guys have any videos that you think will be interesting to watch, don't hesitate to share them. You know, I am building playlists as we go. But so yeah, enough yet. Let's continue the Muromachi period with the second video. If it loads. Okay.
Born in the fire of chaos and rebellion, Japan's second shogunate, the Muromachi Bakufu, was perhaps never destined to maintain its hold on power. After half a century of bloody infighting, the regime has at last established itself as the supreme authority of the land. But a house built on shaky foundations is eventually bound to crumble. Join me today on this 16th episode of Japanese History, the Textbook, as we witness the Muromachi Bakufu begin to lose its grip on power and send the country tumbling into an unprecedented age of violence and disunification, right here on the Buyuden Japanese History Channel.
I will miss his voice, I will miss this intro.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Japanese History, the Textbook, the series where we follow the course of Japanese history through the ages using educational content for Japanese high schoolers as our guide. I want to apologize for the delay between this video and the last entry in the series. I think it's been just about a year, but I'm finally back and I'm ready to bring you all the juicy details about medieval Japan's second shogunate, the Muromachi Bakufu.
It is this thing with discount channels. There's another one I follow, Historically Accurate, is someone who's doing like probably the most, I mean, as much as I love Epic History, Historically Accurate is doing like the most in-depth Napoleon series ever. You know, they're less highly produced videos, but they're insanely in-depth on like everything, you know, like, you know, almost everything he does, the people he talks to, and, you know, like every part of the Napoleonic Wars, I guess. He has started with the French Revolution, but again, his series has been going on for like years and years, kind of like this one, by Buyuden. And obviously, you know, it's a channel that's still kind of like underground, so not full time. And so yeah, like the videos are usually like 1 or 2 hours, but they come out every few months. Sometimes it's like just one video a year or something. And it's really one of the things where like, you know, the big history channel, they tend to do like highly produced videos. And while they're good, they're never like the most in-depth. And then the in-depth channel are not popular enough to be big, but then they take forever to actually release because obviously, you know, they have real life stuff going on, the job and all that. It's always the dilemma, right? Yeah. Like a channel like Buyuden, you know, if I was rich, I would fund them to go full-time with this level of quality of documentary, right? I mean, that's what I always think. If I was rich, I would just fund so many channels to go full-time and do all the content they want. Like, you know, yeah.
It slid from the height of its power and glory into one of the lowest lows of any political entity in Japanese history. As always, if you're interested in seeing the sources I used in the making of this video, you can find those down in the description below. But we've got quite a lot to talk about today, so without further ado, let's jump right in. Japanese History, the Textbook, Episode 16, The Muromachi Period, Part 2. When we last left off with the Muromachi Bakufu, it was being led by its third shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, a man whose reign is often described as the Bakufu's golden age.
It was doing pretty good.
After Yoshimitsu's untimely death from disease just before his 50th birthday, he was succeeded as shogun by his eldest son, a man named Ashikaga Yoshimochi. Yoshimochi is often described as having been the spiritual antithesis to his father during his time as shogun, and it's not hard to see why one might form this opinion. For one, Yoshimochi quickly moved his shogunal headquarters out of his late father's residence and into the former home of his grandfather, Yoshiakira, a move that was clearly intended as a symbolic declaration of Yoshimochi's intention to distance himself from the baggage of the previous regime. Yoshimochi also bowed out of an offer from the imperial court to posthumously bestow his father with the honorific title of retired emperor, an unheard of proposition stemming from Yoshimitsu's near godlike power and influence, but which Yoshimochi and his vassals disliked due to lack of established precedent.
I mean, does it even matter? Like, he's dead, so he's not gonna roll from the grave, so, you know, I don't know. Just do it, make people happy and move on.
Perhaps the greatest point on which Yoshimochi differed from his father was his attitude toward trade with Ming China, as he quickly set about ending the official trade relations that Yoshimitsu had worked so hard to establish.
That seems like a waste.
In the last episode, while the opening of these trade relations had led to Yoshimitsu being declared, quote, King of Japan by the Chinese, he had also been forced to enter into a sort of international lord-vassal relationship wherein he acknowledged his subservience to the Ming Emperor. Yoshimitsu himself.
So it's a pride thing. I mean, it literally doesn't matter. Like, they're all the way over there over the sea. Like, just say, yes, you are my king. And then you have, like, free trade. You know, it doesn't have to mean anything. You're just, like, acting. But I guess it's a pride thing. Like, I am the emperor, so, you know, no one rules over me kind of thing. Okay.
Seems to have found this an acceptable deal, as he was basically exchanging a bit of empty flattery for a steady stream of riches from mainland Asia. But Yoshimochi and his followers found the arrangement insulting, and they swiftly brought it to an end. Yoshimochi's choice to eschew the king title was ironically fitting, as around this time he was beginning to have problems reining in the Bakufu's deputy leaders in the Kanto region, the slightly lower-ranking Ashikaga relatives filling the position of Kamakura Kubo. Remember that the Muromachi Bakufu had adopted a structure that was, and I'm probably going to get angry comments for this, loosely comparable to the late Roman Empire, with central and western Japan.
Always have to compare anything to the Roman Empire.
And being managed by the Ashikaga shogun and his deputy, the Kanrei, and eastern Japan being entrusted to an Ashikaga relative called the Kamakura Kubo, who was also aided by a deputy, the Kanto Kanrei. Since the late 1300s, the Kamakura Kubo had been showing signs of coveting their western cousin's spot at the top, as, after all, they too were direct descendants of Ashikaga Takauji, and they chafed under their perpetual status as the baby shoguns of the eastern backcountry. Up until this point, however, their ambitions had been held in check by their erstwhile subordinates, the Kanto Kanrei, who had bent over backwards to maintain a tenuous peace between Kyoto and Kamakura. That delicate balance, however, at last began to break down in 1416 with the occurrence of an incident remembered as the Rebellion of Zenshu. Zenshu had been the Kanto Kanrei up until...
You guys know I love the Uesugi. Yeah, might be my favorite clan of the Sengoku Jidai.
The previous year, when he...
Even though I don't even know what they do, I just like before anything I should just say, I like the Uesugi because of Uesugi Kenshin from, like, the female version from Sengoku Dance, the visual novel. I should say that's why I like the Uesugi. Not for any other logical reason.
Resigned the post in protest of a decision made by the Kamakura Kubo, which had negatively impacted one of his retainers. Unable to let go of his anger, Zenshu led a cohort of warriors to attack the residence of the Kamakura Kubo, at this time a man by the name of Ashikaga Mochiuji, and seize control of the city of Kamakura. Mochiuji just barely escaped the attack with his life, and he sent word to Shogun Yoshimochi asking for reinforcements to help him strike back at his rebellious former deputy. Yoshimochi, however, was quite hesitant to send aid, as he was well aware of the ambitions of his eastern relatives, and there were even indications that Mochiuji himself, prior to his trouble with the Uesugi, had been plotting against the Bakufu just like his forefathers. After agonizing over his decision for more than a week, Yoshimochi at last came to the conclusion that he couldn't condone rebellion against an official organ of the Bakufu, and he drew up an army which promptly crushed the disobedient Zenshu. The conclusion of the rebellion led to a tentative stabilization of the Kanto region and the relationship between the eastern and western branches of the Ashikaga family. This stabilization was not remotely destined to last, but let's come back to that point a little bit later. In 1423, after nearly 30 years in the office of shogun, Yoshimochi at last abdicated the position to his son.
So, like, he didn't do great, but it doesn't sound like he did that bad, you know?
Who became the fifth shogun, Ashikaga Yoshikazu, with Yoshimochi continuing to act essentially as the godfather of the Bakufu organization behind the scenes. Unfortunately, Yoshikazu would ultimately predecease his father, creating a gap of several years where there actually was no official shogun, although the retired Yoshimochi was of course still acting as the Bakufu's top leadership figure. Yoshimochi would go on to suffer one of the more embarrassing deaths in samurai history in the year 1428,
What did he do?
apparently scratching a boil on his buttocks while bathing one day and accidentally tearing it open, leading to an infection that eventually brought about a lethal fever. Yoshimochi endured the fever long enough to be cognizant of his own impending death and thus
Is this like this is the kind of thing where, like, you know, it happens, but it also sounds like slander, right? Like some historian down the line, you know, just wanted to slander this guy. You know, he died by scratching his butt too hard or something. Like, come on. At the same time, you know, people die in dumb ways sometimes, and obviously, like, emperors and kings aren't immune to that. Yeah.
have ample time to name a successor, but with his own heir already dead and no obvious choices really jumping out at him, he instead chose to leave the decision to the leaders of the Bakufu's top
That's never a good idea.
constituent families, the top tier of the Shugo daimyo. These men ultimately decided to choose the next shogun by drawing lots, with 4 of Yoshimochi's surviving younger brothers being entered into this raffle as its participants. While to modern ears this sounds like an absolutely preposterous way to choose the de facto sovereign of a country, one must keep in mind that drawing...
I mean, is it any worse than just choosing people by blood, right? Which is what they're doing anyway, but you know what I mean? Like, it's clearly not a meritocracy in any kind of way in the first place. Like, people, like most of those emperors, you know, some of them end up being good, but it's not because they deserve to be there from, like, proving that they had the skills. It's just because the blood and the family name and all that. So I really don't think it matters in the end. I mean, you know, if you're lucky with a draw like that, you get someone who doesn't want the role, and people who usually don't want the role are actually kind of doing better, you know.
Lots has a long history of religious significance in Japan, and for centuries was regarded as being one method of ascertaining the will of the gods. Even today, if you visit any shrine in Japan, you will almost certainly be able to buy an omikuji, a small piece of folded paper which you pull from a box at random, and which basically tells you your fortune and horoscope all in one. And this is a relic of this ancient practice. Just like the omikuji, the Bakufu's raffle was carried out at a shrine, Kyoto's Iwashimizu Hachimangu, and the man ultimately chosen to become the 6th shogun of the Muromachi Bakufu was a fellow whom history remembers as Ashikaga Yoshinori. In a humorous parallel of his brother and predecessor, Yoshinori also embarked on a style of government in direct contrast with that of the prior regime, the regime of said brother and predecessor Yoshimochi. Part of this may have been personal animosity toward his late sibling, but part of it also seems to have been a general distaste shared among many of the Bakufu's top officials for the ex-shogun who had deliberately chosen not to name an heir even while well aware of his impending death. Yoshinori reversed Yoshimochi's policy on China, sending an envoy to the Ming in 1432 and being rewarded with his father's old title of King of Japan 2 years later. One can imagine that Yoshinori must have found this title rather pleasing, as from the moment that he was invested with the office of shogun, he made it clear that he saw himself as a political leader and that he intended to be very involved with the running of the country's government. Yoshinori adopted a style of government in which, rather than leaving day-to-day affairs up to his deputy, the Kanrei, he himself would personally preside over discussions of policy and the arbitration of legal cases, a style which catered to Yoshinori's ego but also had the side effect of slightly marginalizing his top vassals.
I forgot which one it was before, but also, like, it's too much work for one guy, right? I mean, that's the reason you have all this, you know, people under you, because you can't take care of everything yourself. But there's always, you know, a shogun or an emperor that ends up, like, with this idea of trying to do everything themselves.
Right around the time that Yoshinori was being invested with the position of shogun, a number of events were occurring that foreshadowed the decades of instability that were on the horizon as Japan headed deeper into the 15th century. The first of these were a pair of uprisings in which elements of society outside of the traditional Bushi warrior class made organized attempts to violently extract concessions from the forces of political authority. The former was an incident in 1428 known as the Shoucho no Tokuseiki, in which a large number of goods carriers called bashaku, private contractors who utilized horses to transport goods around the country, rose up in arms to demand from the government a widespread cancellation of their financial debts. The latter uprising,
Okay.
which took place in 1429 and was called the Harima no Tsuchi-ikki, saw the farming folk of Harima province take up arms in an effort to drive their samurai overlords out of the province. You will notice that both uprisings contain the Japanese word ikki, a word often translated as uprising, but which technically refers to the unified group of individuals forming the core of an uprising. The Shoucho no Tokusei Ikki and the Harima no Tsuchi Ikki are famous early examples of these grassroots uprisings, but they were far from the last, as they would become a growing trend as the 15th century went on. On the occasion of an ikki's formation, its participants would typically gather in the courtyard of a shrine and all sign a written vow of allegiance, whereupon they would then burn this document, mix its ashes into holy water, and take turns drinking this mixture such that they would all be bound together on a spiritual level. While both of the aforementioned uprisings were ultimately quelled by Bakufu forces, neither was really so much a condemnation of the Muromachi Bakufu itself as it was simply the result of the growing power of Japan's peasantry. This process had been steadily taking place for centuries now, but the growing unrest resulting from its culmination was certainly not making the Bakufu's job any easier. The next ominous incident to occur in the historical sequence, however, was a direct manifestation of the Bakufu's problems, and this was the Eikyo Rebellion of 1438. The Eikyo Rebellion was, in a nutshell, the first direct military brawl between the Muromachi Bakufu and its little brother organization out east, the Kamakura. At the time of the rebellion, the Kamakura Kubo position was still in the possession of Ashikaga Mochiuji, the man who had had his skin reluctantly saved by Ashikaga Yoshimochi during the rebellion of Uesugi Zenshu 20 years prior. Following that incident's conclusion, Mochiuji had stayed relatively well behaved for a time, likely hoping that he would be next in line to succeed the heirless Yoshimochi as shogun. This ambition, however, was crushed when Ashikaga Yoshinori drew his winning lot and became the Bakufu's sixth shogun. From this point on, the jilted Mochiuji became much more brazenly antagonistic toward his relatives in Kyoto, with the two sides nearly coming to blows on several occasions and peace only being maintained via the earnest efforts of Mochiuji's Kanto Kanre, Uesugi Norizane. In 1438, however, Mochiuji at last pushed his luck a bit too far. First, at his son's coming-of-age ceremony, he spurned the traditional family custom wherein the scions of his line would take the second character of the shogun's name and utilize it as the first character of their own new adult name as a symbolic gesture of fealty. Mochiuji's son should have come of age as Ashikaga Nori something, but he instead took his first steps into the adult world as Ashikaga Yoshihisa, a deliberate slap in the face to Shogun Yoshinori. Not content with this mere etiquette transgression, Mochiuji then began making moves to launch a military campaign against Uesugi Norizane to rid himself of that ball and chain that was the office of Kanto Kanre.
That's probably the big one. I mean, I understand tradition, but I feel like the name thing cannot be that bad. But this, yeah, that's more like it. That's enough to attack.
The fiery Yoshinori, however, was not in the mood to entertain these affronts for even a moment, and within 2 months he had dispatched Bakufu forces out east and quelled Mochiuji's nascent rebellion with overwhelming force. Mochiuji and his son were placed under confinement in Kamakura, where they both took the tonsure in an effort to display their total capitulation, but Yoshinori hadn't the slightest intention of letting his relatives off the hook. Uesugi Norizane was ordered by Yoshinori to eliminate the defenseless Mochiuji, and after admirably trying and failing to obtain mercy for his former liege/former foe, he begrudgingly carried out his orders, surrounding the temple where Mochiuji was being held and forcing him to fall on his sword. Unfortunately, the demise of Mochiuji did not bring stability to the Kanto region, as the following year, one of Mochiuji's former retainers, one Yukyu Jitomo, declared his rebellion against the Bakufu, holding up in his family's castle with 2 of Mochiuji's young orphan sons. Ujitomo was joined in his rebellion by a number of other powerful local warriors, vividly illustrating the level of respect that the Kamakura Kubo had commanded in the Kanto region. The rebels did eventually fall to the army that the Bakufu drew up to deal with them, but the fact that so many warriors had been willing to defy the shogun for the sake of the deceased Kamakura Kubo was hardly a promising sign for the Bakufu.
But it should have been obvious. I mean, this system of like the east and west shogunate clearly, I mean, that kind of division is clearly not a good thing. It was always going to build up to, to conflict eventually, yeah? Yeah.
With the Eikyo rebellion's end, the Bakufu had, for the time being, dealt with the most obvious threat to its authority, but the proverbial storm clouds continued to gather on the horizon. As Ashikaga Yoshinori's reign went on, his style of leadership gradually took on a more and more tyrannical bent. And indeed, if you've heard of the man before, I'm willing to make a bet that this is the characteristic for which you know him. Now, that being said, none of Yoshinori's predecessors had exactly been pushovers, with Yoshimochi and Yoshimitsu, for example, having also exhibited oppressive and uncooperative attitudes toward the aristocracy and the clergy from time to time. But Yoshinori's brand of tyranny was characterized by its own special flavor of cruelty and vindictiveness. Yoshinori was known to mercilessly punish his enemies over personal and sometimes even very trivial matters, and he also had a penchant for going after people who dared to even gossip about his domineering ways. The aristocrat Madeno Koji Tokifusa famously wrote of Yoshinori in his diary, "Bannin kyofu, yunakare, yunakare. All live in terror, speak not, speak not."
Scary.
Yoshinori's tyrannical ways seem to have reached their peak following the resolution of the Eikyo Rebellion and the Yuki Uprising, as he was no longer distracted by outside issues and could turn his full attention to meddling with the lives and affairs of the Shugo daimyo serving under him, engineering the deaths of some and interfering in the succession plans of others. His reign of terror at last came to an end in 1441 when he was invited to the Kyoto residence of the Shugo daimyo Akamatsu Mitsusuke for a banquet celebrating his successful subjugation of the Kanto region. Several drinks into the festivities, a group of Mitsusuke's warriors suddenly emerged from the room behind the shogun's seat and brutally assassinated him as the rest of the banquet's guests looked on. Several of Yoshinori's associates attempted to fight back, but the majority of them simply panicked and ran, with not even a single man choosing to commit seppuku by the slain Yoshinori's side, behavior which normally could have been expected of a shogun's close retainers in such an unfortunate situation. As you have probably surmised, this assassination was planned by the banquet's host, Akamatsu Mitsusuke, who enacted the plan as a preemptive strike against Yoshinori, having heard rumor that he himself was next on the vindictive shogun's hit list. Mitsusuke set fire to his residence and fled with Yoshinori's severed head to one of the provinces under his jurisdiction, Harima Province. But within a few months, a Bakufu army had pursued him there and forced him to pay the price for his treachery with his life. Mitsusuke must have known that this outcome was realistically a very likely one, and the fact that he was willing to face such a risk in order to eliminate Yoshinori speaks volumes about just how stressful and despair-inducing the atmosphere in the capital must have been during Yoshinori's tenure. Following the shogun's humiliating demise, the Bakufu's top leaders gathered together and chose to have the late Yoshinori succeeded by his 8-year-old son, the boy whom we know today as Ashikaga Yoshikatsu. Yoshikatsu, however, died of disease just 2 years later, and he was succeeded by another 8-year-old, his younger brother, known at the time as Sanharu, but remembered to history as Ashikaga Yoshimasa. As Yoshimasa was just a child, the day-to-day affairs of government were taken over by his top vassals and his kanrei, but the kanrei position...
I need to look something up. I mentioned Sengoku Dance earlier, and there's an Ashikaga in Sengoku Dance. I need to look up which one it is. It looks very funny. Ashikaga. Oh, Shoshin Ashikara. Is he based on the... It was also Takauji? Wait, is this in Sengoku? Oh, there's no image. Shoshin Ashikaga. Yeah, this guy. Yeah. It looks kind of crazy. Is he based on someone real? Or is it just historical, like fiction? Yeah, I think it's just like, it's just in Sengoku Dance. I think he's not actually... I mean, it might be based on someone, but I don't know. Based on... I don't know. Well, actually, originally it was supposed to be a member of the Ojo. Okay, anyway. Oh, by the way, if you're wondering like which Kenshin I keep talking about, Uesugi Kenshin, I'm talking about this one, which, yeah, I'm sure that's not how the real one is, but, you know, this is the one I'm talking about. Anyway,
and went on to be vigorously hot-potatoed back and forth between the Hatakeyama and Hosokawa clan patriarchs, and the remaining years of Yoshimasa's childhood and adolescence were characterized by infighting and lack of unity within the Bakufu government. Yoshimasa's wet nurse and foster caregivers also got in on the action, and it is said that Yoshimasa's mother, Hino Shigeko, was really the only individual in the Bakufu at the time making any effort to hold things together. In 1458, a 23-year-old Ashikaga Yoshimasa at last began to make moves toward taking the reins of government and establishing the Bakufu's first shogun-led administration in nearly 2 decades. He initiated all the standard ceremonial steps designed to indicate to the outside world that a new era of leadership had begun, such as taking on a high imperial court post, beginning to use an aristocratic-style signature, and exacting oaths of honest service from his corps of administrators, among other things. In hindsight, though, most of these gestures were just that, empty gestures, and Yoshimasa himself seems to have been more concerned with pouring time and money into remodeling his lavish homes or attending gratuitous numbers of Sarugaku theater performances. Despite his lack of real passion for leadership, he seems to have at least had an interest in maintaining his status as the Bakufu's leader, as in 1464 he called his younger brother out of the priesthood to become his official successor, with this brother taking on the secular name Ashikaga Yoshimi. The following year, Yoshimasa...
Something that you hear sometimes which I don't really get, I mean, you know, like, is it that simple? When you're a priest, isn't it like some kind of commitment for life kind of thing? I mean, you can just say, okay, I'm done, I'm bored, I'll be an emperor.
Yoshimasa and his wife, Hino Tomiko, were blessed with their first son, a boy who would eventually become Ashikaga Yoshihisa. But Yoshimasa made no move to boot his aforementioned brother Yoshimi out of the successor position. Remember that throughout Japanese history, one of the most popular methods of wielding power was to retire from an extremely exalted post and then become the grand puppet master pulling all the strings of one's subsequent successors. By making his younger brother his official heir, it is thought that Yoshimasa intended to retire early from the post of shogun and install his brother as an obedient interim placeholder who could keep...
Wouldn't it be easier to just use your like little kid son? That's how most of the emperor managed to do it. Because, you know, your grown-up brother is maybe not easy to control.
The proverbial seat warm until his son came of age. It would have been a sound enough plan in theory, but the circumstances surrounding the Bakufu, as well as Yoshimasa's own personality, ultimately led history to proceeding in a slightly different direction. You see, despite Yoshimasa having taken on official leadership of Bakufu affairs, his presence had failed to prevent his top vassals from continuing to feud endlessly amongst themselves, and as his term went on, he himself began to grow more and more visibly disinterested in running his government. A 1466 diary entry by a powerful member of the clergy records that, "The daimyo plan everything while the shogun looks on. I hear that Lord Yoshimi is left in charge of things. I hear that the state of the Bakufu is highly peculiar. It's all quite outrageous. I fear for the future." The denizens of Kyoto had good reason to worry about the state of the Bakufu's affairs, as its grip on the rest of the country had already been slowly disintegrating since the assassination of Ashikaga Yoshinori. Let's rewind the clock back to the 1440s when Shogun Yoshimasa was still just a child and a figurehead, and let's once again revisit the Kanto region. I'm sorry, I know everyone's probably getting whiplash here with all the back and forth, but we do need to revisit the Kanto region as it was only continuing its transformation.
It is such a, you know, I like watching a study video, but I can't even imagine trying to make one and trying to, you know, like keep up the logic. You know, you might say just tell things in chronological order, right? But even if you do that, you probably have stuff that you have to go back to, right? Because, you know, are you gonna tell the chronological order of like every character in all this? But no, this person is only relevant later, so you have to talk about them later. I mean, it must be such a mess to think of like where to put what.
Into being more and more of a volatile powder keg. Immediately following the Eikyo Rebellion, the posts of both Kamakura Kubo and Kanto Kanre had been left vacant, with the occupant of the former, Mochiuji, having obviously died, and the occupant of the latter, Mochiuji's executioner, Uesugi Norizane, having retired and entered the priesthood as a gesture of penance. In 1447, however, both positions were refilled with the respective sons of both men, resurrecting the Kamakura Kubo Kanto Kanrei system for the first time in nearly a decade. However, unsurprisingly, the two men, Ashikaga Shigeuji and Uesugi Noritada, got along like oil and water given the history between their fathers, and by 1450, their respective factions were already beginning to clash militarily. The Bakufu stepped in and brokered a peace, but in 1454, Shigeuji ruined any hope of that lasting by inviting Noritada to his home and then having him murdered like some kind of mafia hit. Shigeuji had avenged his father, but he had also ignited an all-out war between his and his late foe's factions, a war remembered as the Kyotoku Rebellion that would go on to last for the next quarter-century. In the early stages of the conflict, Shigeuji left Kamakura for one campaign against the Uesugi, whereupon a Bakufu-aligned Shugo daimyo, the leader of the Imagawa clan, for those interested, stepped in to seize the city in his absence. Shigeuji thus found himself stranded at a base he had established in a place called Koga in Shimousa province, and from this point on he became referred to not as the Kamakura Kubo, but as the Koga Kubo. In 1457, Shogun Yoshimasa called one of his brothers out of the priesthood and appointed him to be the new Kamakura Kubo, but this brother, named Ashikaga Masatomo, only managed to make it as far as a place called Horikoshi in Izu province, before the unstable political conditions of the war-torn Kanto region forced him to grind to a halt and call off his plans to enter Kamakura.
What a mess!
This way, the Kanto region came to be embroiled in a three-way tug-of-war between the forces of the Kanto Kanrei, the Koga Kubo, and Ashikaga Masatomo, who from this point on came to be referred to as the Horikoshi Kubo. And even after the Kyotoku Rebellion's end in the late 1470s, true order would never really return to the region, at least not for another 100+ years.
That's crazy.
The Kanto region had become a no-man's land where even the Bakufu's authority could no longer be fully relied upon, but things back in central Japan were also on the verge of taking a massive turn for the worse. The primary driver for this state of affairs was chronic infighting between and within the Bakufu's most powerful clans, namely the Shiba, the Hatakeyama, the Hosokawa, and the Yamana. By the 1450s and 1460s, the former two, the Shiba and the Hatakeyama, were embroiled in vicious succession struggles amongst rival family members, and these struggles were only made worse by meddling from the leaders of the latter clans, the Hosokawa and the Yamana, who, along with Shogun Yoshimasa himself, enthusiastically interfered in what probably ought to have been left as private family affairs. Yoshimasa's own family affairs were also beginning to slide into chaos, as animosity flared between his brother and official successor Yoshimi and the supporters of his young son Yoshihisa, who included some of his closest confidants as well as his own wife, the boy's mother. The tension at last bubbled over into outright violence in the early months of 1467, when, thanks to the machinations of the Yamana family leader Yamana Sozen, the two major rivals for the headship of the Hatakeyama clan clashed militarily within the city of Kyoto itself. Following this skirmish, the aforementioned Sozen and his main political rival, Hosokawa Katsumoto, began amassing their own troops inside the capital, and by the summer months, the city had devolved into a full-on war zone. The conflict, which we are witnessing the opening stages of here, is remembered to history as the Onin Bunmei War.
Oh, so this is the Onin War, okay. Okay. Should I continue? Because this is a bit early to end this one. But again, I think this is going to be covered in the Shogunate video we're going to watch. I guess let's skip that part maybe. Let's go to the next part, the look at the common folk. Let's do that.
With the peasantry, who, as I alluded to earlier in the video, were really beginning to transform into a formidable, independent layer of society by this time in history. At the dawn of the Middle Ages, Japan's villages tended to be sparse and scattered collections of homes with very small populations. But by the late Kamakura period, the agricultural peasantry began coming together to create more tight-knit, densely populated settlements, with these first emerging in the central parts of the country and then gradually appearing in all corners of the archipelago. These villages, which were managed by the farmers themselves, are referred to as so or so-son, and by the Muromachi period they had become powerful enough to stand up to their feudal overlords, doing
Very
things
nice.
such as demanding tax cuts during times of poor harvest or calling for the dismissal of local samurai land managers. These villages were centered around their village jinja, or shrine, and village citizenship, if you will, was represented by one's entry into the organizational body which coordinated religious ceremonies and festivals. These individuals were called sohyakusho, and they ran their villages by means of council meetings called yoriai, where they discussed matters such as nengu tax collection, communal land use, and village laws. As mutual trust and group unity were highly important to these villages, crimes such as stealing were often punished very harshly, with it not being uncommon for thieves to be put to death for their crimes.
Wow.
The most powerful members of these villages sometimes became influential enough to actually enter into lord-vassal bonds with their shugo or other overlords, and in the process obtain the status of samurai. And these individuals are referred to with the historical term jisamurai, literally
jisamurai.
samurai of the soil or samurai of the earth. As we saw earlier, there were many occasions during the Muromachi period in which
Recently, well, a month ago I was playing there's a game called Mountain Blade Battleworld, and there's a mod called Sokuro, which is about the Sengoku Jedi, and you can recruit a lot of like different troops for your army basically, and some of it is Jisamurai, yeah, which are usually, like in the game at least, they start as lower level troops, I guess, than normal samurai, I guess.
portions of the empowered agricultural class organized ikki and launched uprisings in order to directly exert influence on the central government. One factor which had led to these lower classes of people becoming powerful enough to have this level of influence was the evolution of the agriculture of the Muromachi period, which was characterized by diversification and intensification. The practice of nimosaku, or double cropping rice and wheat, became even more widespread than it had been in the Kamakura period, thanks to advances in irrigation and drainage technology. In central Japan, we even began to see examples of triple cropping, or sammosaku, in which farmers alternatingly cultivated rice, wheat, and soba. Moreover, a wider variety of types of rice began to be cultivated, with champa rice, or daitomai, from continental Asia particularly catching on with the peasantry due to its resistance to drought and pests. Other advances from the Kamakura period, such as iron farm implements, the water wheel, and the utilization of beasts of burden, took root on an even wider scale during the Muromachi period, and a new type of water wheel from China, known as the keel wheel, or ryukotsha, also began to see use. This was also the era when we begin to see the widespread use of human and animal excrement as fertilizer, and while the former may be slightly shocking to modern sensibilities, this led to more fertile soil and more stable harvests. In addition to
it's not that surprising, I think it's pretty well known. I mean, today you might not use human shit for that, right? But, the concept is there, and I'm actually surprised that, this came this late to Japan, the concept of all that for fertilizer. I always thought it was older than that as a concept.
Basic food staples, slightly more niche products such as hemp, mulberry, indigo, lacquer, and tea began to be widely cultivated for their application in handicrafts, leading to a richer and more active market for commercial products, which in turn raised the basic income level of the farming class. The number of guilds specializing in these various products began to rapidly increase, and these guilds, many of which had originated as subsidiary organs of large temples and shrines, started to become more autonomous and independent organizations. Thanks to the gradual decentralization of power and migration of influential warriors out into the provinces after the Onin War, specialty local products developed more rapidly than ever under their patronage, and certain regions began to become famous for specific goods. Several crafts which saw a boom under these conditions were swordsmithing, fine textile weaving, and sake production. The fishing industry also expanded thanks to the development.
You'll probably never have time to rest as a blacksmith here, with the amount of sword that you have to make.
Of new types of nets, which in turn led to fiercer conflicts over good fishing areas, as well as more complex diplomacy between fishing villages. The lumbering industry too made great leaps as a result of the popularization of the two-man saw, and large markets specifically for the sale of lumber were opened in places such as Kyoto and Kamakura. Speaking of markets, the general market days, which we saw begin to be held several times a month during the Kamakura period, increased in frequency during the Muromachi period, with 6 times a month being standard by the late 1400s. The guilds, which I mentioned a moment ago, played a large role.
See, this is the kind of stuff I like to learn about too. As I said right now, like this series of Japan history stream is, for now, we're mostly going through like the different period and getting like a very total overall view of the period. But eventually, I'd love to find videos about stuff like this, you know, like the more common life of common people. There's a channel called Voice from the Past, I think, that does stuff like that. One time I'd watched a video where it was basically retelling the diary of like a samurai or something, and stuff like that I really enjoy sometimes, like the more human story, the more personal stories of the daily life in a different time, rather than, the more like, emperor story of running the countries and all the big fights and all that. Sometimes I want more of the human stuff, if that makes sense.
In these markets, with membership in a guild typically being necessary if one wanted to participate in said market and sell one's wares. Outside of these marketplaces, large cities began to see the emergence of small, permanent shops with street-facing display shelves called misedana, Japan's first examples of something along the lines of a modern store. Additionally, there was also a marked increase in the number of peddlers who walked around cities and towns hawking their goods, and interestingly, this particular field seems to have had a great deal of female participation. At the time, women seem to have been well known for peddling things such as charcoal, firewood, fish, folding fans, cloth, and tofu in particular. This increase in mercantile activity across the country, combined with the gradual separation and independence of merchant groups from Japan's traditional power-holding institutions, set the stage for the country's merchants to begin asserting themselves as a wealthy and influential stratum of society, whose members would leave an indelible footprint on the history of the country for centuries to come. Continuing on from the Kamakura period, Chinese coinage continued to assert its position as Japan's most popular de facto currency, although this now included new Ming Dynasty coinage in addition to the older Song Dynasty coins which had been circulating for centuries. The popularity of this second-hand foreign currency naturally opened the door for rampant counterfeiting, and financial transactions began to be plagued by the problem of erizeni, or coin choosing, in which one party in a financial transaction would comb through the other party's cash and reject any coins which they suspected of being fake, or simply felt were too degraded from age. While this doesn't strike one as a particularly unreasonable policy, it became an impediment to smooth business dealings, and the bakufu and the daimyo started requiring people to allow a certain percentage of the money they handled to be quote-unquote bad coinage. Remember, this money isn't being issued by Japan's government, so the people need to work with what they've got, and if they start being too picky about the quality, the whole economy becomes liable to disintegrate. With the increase in the production of specialty local goods, long-distance transactions became much more common than they had been in the past, and the role of cargo ships called kaisen became more important than ever. In 1445, for example, more than 2,700 ships coming from various ports around the Seto Inland Sea are reported to have docked in Hyogo Harbor, located in the modern city of Kobe, over the course of the year. Overland transportation also became big business, with bashaku horseback transporters, the guys we saw rise up in protest earlier in the video, becoming a fixture of the country's roads, together with wagon-based transporters called shashaku. Large, bustling towns started to spring up around major commercial...
Again, it's amazing to think of like the different ways things like that used to work at the time. I mean, imagine, just like, like today, I can buy something on Amazon and get it the next day. But back then, like the guy was doing some kind of like, transportation. He has like some horse, maybe like bulls and cows, and he has to like load them with baggage, and then like he has to walk for like days, weeks, months across the country to get to his destination. Along the way, he has to like, be careful of not losing stuff. What happens if an animal die? He has to like be careful of bandits. I mean, man, stuff like that is really something.
Hubs, particularly ports, and a new generation of provincial cities began to emerge to join the ranks of established urban centers like Kyoto and Kamakura. One famous example of provincial urbanization during the Muromachi period is the town of Kusado Sengen, which was located in modern Hiroshima Prefecture and existed until the early Edo period, when it was destroyed by a massive flood in 1673. The town's appearance and layout were gradually unearthed over the course of a 30-year excavation beginning in the early 1960s, giving scholars a fascinating look at the characteristics of a late medieval
That's really
settlement.
cool.
Lying just to the east of the still extant Myo Temple, Kusado Sengen seems to have simultaneously been both a temple town and a port town, and numerous cargo labels and financial documents recorded on wooden slabs have been recovered from the site. Additionally, the site has also produced a great deal of foreign and domestic porcelain, as well as craftsmen's tools for industries like blacksmithing and lacquering, and a large amount of daily life items, including knives, chopsticks,
That's a treasure
pots,
trove.
boxes, and coins. The subject of foreign porcelain, by the way, gives us a nice segue into what I'd like to touch on next, namely what was going on with Japan's neighbors during the Muromachi period. We've already seen that Ashikaga Yoshimitsu and at least some of his successors were enthusiastically trading with the Ming Dynasty Chinese. But what was the historical backdrop for this relationship to even arise in the first place? Well, you see, as the Muromachi Bakufu was establishing its regime in the late 14th century, the rest of the East Asian world was also in the midst of a major transitionary phase.
Are we past the Mongol Empire at this point?
While Japan never had official diplomatic relations open with the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty, hence, the whole Mongol invasion thing, trade carried out between the two countries by private individuals had actually been a thriving endeavor. In conjunction with this private trade, piracy had also grown to be a major problem in the Sea of Japan. The pirates of this era are known as Wako, a name whose first kanji character, wa, is the old character for Japan, and whose second character can mean anything from hatred to despised enemy to one who inflicts harm. Put them together and you get something along the lines of Japanese scourge. These pirates made their base in the islands off the northern coast of Kyushu, places like Tsushima and Iki, and they ravaged the coasts of China and Korea in bands ranging from just a few ships to large fleets of several hundred. Their criminal behavior was so rampant that the Korean kingdom of Goryeo sent official messengers to Japan begging for something to be done about them, and they are even regarded as being one of several factors that may have eventually led to that kingdom's fall in 1392. In 1368, a Chinese rebel leader by the name of Zhu Yuanchang, the future Hongwu emperor, overthrew the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty to establish the Ming dynasty, and this Ming dynasty's leaders would all be members of China's majority ethnic group, the Han people. In an effort to re-establish the China-centric Pan-Asian order which the Chinese emperors had long seen as the ideal state of the world, messengers were sent out to various neighboring Asian countries, and this is how Ashikaga Yoshimitsu eventually got his opportunity to be made King of Japan and participate in trade with the Chinese. With this relationship officially established, trade vessels between the countries would need to carry an official trade license issued by the Ming called a kango in Japanese.
Okay.
When such a license was created, an official seal would be stamped on a piece of paper, and that paper would then be cut in two down the middle, with half going to the Muromachi Bakufu to serve as their trade license, and the other half being retained by the Chinese.
Cool
When a
concept.
Japanese trade vessel arrived in China, its license would be checked against its sister half to ensure that the two actually matched up, verifying the license's authenticity. This checking process would be carried out in Ningbo, and the trading itself would occur in Beijing, with the expenses of the visiting Japanese envoys all being taken care of by their hosts. The most common items brought by the Japanese on these visits were copper, sulfur, gold, swords, fans, and lacquerware, and the items most commonly received in return were raw silk, textiles, brocade thread, sugar, ceramics, books, and paintings. The latter items, when brought back to Japan, were referred to as karamono, and they were highly prized as sophisticated cultural artifacts, which in turn helped inspire many of the domestic cultural achievements of Muromachi period Japan, which we will discuss in a little bit. In total, 17 official trade embassies were sent to China by the Muromachi Bakufu after the outset of diplomatic relations in 1404, with the final voyage occurring in 1547 during the Bakufu's years of greatly waning influence. Japan's great temples and the powerful members of the Shugo daimyo class also participated in this trade, and after the Onin War and the decline in power of the Muromachi shoguns, the embassies themselves were mostly organized under the leadership of either the Hosokawa clan, who were allied with the merchants of the city of Sakai, or the Ouchi clan, who were allied with the merchants of Hakata. In 1523, after affiliates of the two clans clashed violently on Chinese soil, the Ouchi pushed the Hosokawa out of the operation and came to monopolize Sino-Japanese trade until their own sudden downfall in 1551. After the end of official trade relations between the two countries, the Wako pirates once again reared their ugly heads, although this time it is believed that only about a third of them were actually Japanese, with the other 2/3 having been a diverse mix, including a good...
I was gonna say, like, does only Japan has pirated this time? I mean, Korea, China, most countries would have pirates, I mean, yeah. You would assume so.
...deal of Chinese and Portuguese. These Wako 2.0 pirates mostly operated in the South China Sea and the South Pacific, and one of their most famous leaders was a captain of Chinese descent named Wang Ji, or Ochoku in Japanese, who remains a well-known and controversial figure in both China and Japan today. Wang Ji led a fleet of hundreds of ships, referred to himself as a king, and carried out trade with several of Japan's great 16th century warlords before he was finally captured and executed by the Ming in 1559, after which point the Wako pirates once again began to lose steam. On the Korean peninsula, the renowned general Yi Songye had overthrown the last kings of the Goryeo dynasty in 1388 and established the new kingdom of Joseon in 1392. This new dynasty quickly reached out to Japan in pursuit of diplomatic relations and a crackdown by the Bakufu on Wako piracy. In 1419, a Korean army of 200 ships and roughly 17,000 soldiers would actually make landfall on Tsushima in an attempt to directly purge the pirates residing there. And while the incident caused...
It sounds to... like... wrap a mind around the amount of pirates that there must have been for them to need this much fucking troop to deal with them, right? I mean, even when I think of the, you know, the famous era of piracy in the world, right? You know, like the Blackbeard, Teach, and all that. Like, there wasn't that much pirate at this time. It was still like, you know, like a ship with a crew of a few hundred men there, and you know, there's maybe like a few dozen ship or something, right? Like, this seems like the numbers are crazy in terms of pirates. Yeah.
A bit of a political uproar, relations between Choson, Korea, and the Muromachi Bakufu eventually got back to a cordial place. With the emergence of the Choson dynasty, the powerful warriors of western and southern Japan jostled with one another to establish trade relations with the new kingdom, and in response to the chaos, Joseon eventually restricted their official trade to the So family in 1443. The So themselves were restricted to sending no more than 50 boats per year, and all trade was to be carried out in one of 3 Korean port cities, Busan, Jinhae, or Ulsan. Reception halls for Japanese embassies were set up in these 3 ports, and in the capital of Hansong, modern Seoul. And by the end of the 15th century, there were about 3,000 Japanese permanently residing in the aforementioned 3 port cities. In 1510, however, a disturbance broke out between many of these residents and their Korean hosts, and from this point onwards, trade between Japan and Korea gradually began to decline. The primary trade goods brought to Korea by the Japanese included the same copper and sulfur that the Chinese favored, but these were also supplemented by products from Southeast Asia and Okinawa that the Japanese merchants were relaying onward, such as pepper, medicinal ingredients, and aromatics. The product from Korea, which the Japanese were most interested in importing, was cotton, and its great influx during this era exerted a massive influence on Japanese daily life. Over in Okinawa, the island was controlled by 3 large principalities called Hokuzan, Chuzan, and Nanzan, literally north...
I always kind of forget about Okinawa in a sense. I know it's Japanese, but, you know, I just kind of forget about it. Like, in terms of, like, it's a prefecture and all that.
Mountain, Middle Mountain, and South Mountain, around the time when the Muromachi Bakufu was.
Like, what I mean is that, when I think of history, I forget about it. I mean, I know it's part of Japan, right? I've seen so many great anime in Okinawa, like Aquatop. Recently there was I can't understand the girl I like speaking Okinawan dialect and I can't understand her. There's some good stuff, right? But it's just, when you tell me, thinking of history, I don't know why. I guess because it's far away from the mainland, even more than Tsushima.
Getting its start over in Japan. For those who are not aware, by the way, Okinawa was very much not yet a part of Japan at this time in history.
Okay, well then I'm confused. Maybe that's why. Then I was right to not think of Okinawa yet. Okay.
Each of these principalities engaged in diplomacy with the Ming, and each conceived of itself as a kingdom. In the final decade of the 1300s, a man called Shohashi managed to get his father appointed king of Chuzan, and he then used his new position of power to conquer the other two principalities, and eventually found the United Kingdom of Ryukyu in 1429.
Okay.
With the city of Shuri as its capital, the new kingdom vigorously engaged in trade with both Japan and China, and came to be an important relay hub between the various countries of Southeast Asia, with its port of Naha constantly awash in trade goods from all around the region. With all that was going on both inside and outside Japan during the 13, 14, and 1500s, it's not surprising that the Muromachi period had a unique cultural flavor that distinctly set it apart from the eras which preceded it and set the stage for those which followed. In the Muromachi period, the samurai had at last come to the fore as Japan's primary cultural influencers, and they established a new sort of culture which went on to characterize the era. This culture was unique in that while it was centered around the samurai, it contained a diverse mixture of elements from previously disparate worlds that were brought together by samurai influence. The samurai preference for Zen Buddhism meant that Muromachi culture had a strong Zen flavor to it, but it also took heavy influence.
In a sense, it's I do understand that samurai, they do, some of them do a lot of meditation and, it's not just about fighting, but it's still I think a lot of people's idea of samurai is, a ultimate warrior fighter kind of thing. And so you don't really associate that with Zen, even though at the same time, sure, I guess 99% of the time, they don't do fighting, so, it's interesting.
From traditional aristocratic culture, which had seeped deeply into the fabric of the warrior class thanks to the choice to headquarter the Muromachi Bakufu in Kyoto. Moreover, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu's choice to re-establish trade with China sparked a renewed influx of aristocratic goods from the Asian mainland, and these exerted a profound continental influence on Muromachi culture. Finally, the substantial growth in the societal power of the Japanese peasantry going on during the period meant that this new culture would be absorbed and subsequently influenced by a far wider portion of society than had ever been possible before. Many things which we think of today as quintessential
I've used this image before for thumbnail.
Elements of Japanese culture, such as no theater, tea ceremony, and ikebana flower arrangement, amongst other things, had their foundations established during the Muromachi period, thanks to the period's unique and diverse cultural environment. The period's culture can broadly be divided into three phases: Nambokcho culture, Kitayama culture, and Higashiyama culture. The first, Nambokcho culture, is, as its name suggests, the culture of the Northern and Southern Courts period, or in other words, the mid to late 1300s. Nambokcho culture is characterized by the youthful vigor resulting from the socio-political changing of the guard and a growing awareness of history spurred on by the era's many conflicts. It's no coincidence that this era saw the birth of a number of important pieces of historical writing, whether they be actual history texts such as Kitabatake Chikafusa's Jin no Shotoki, a very emperor-centric history of Japan, or romanticized military epics such as the Taiheki, which tells the story of the struggle between the northern and southern courts, the Gikeki, which gives an account of the life and adventures of Minamoto no Yoshitsune, and the Soga Monogatari, which, well, I've got a whole video on that one, so check it out if you're interested. Another brand of literature which achieved major prominence around this time was Renga, a style of poetry in which people would get together and take turns improvising stanzas to long, collaborative poems. While Renga had enjoyed some degree of popularity since the Kamakura period, it was during the Nambokcho period that it at last achieved a highly respected status on par with the older waka poetry, which was itself approaching the end of its glory days among the cultural elite. Another cultural phenomenon which first began to take off as an element of Nambokcho culture was the widespread consumption of tea, which, as you may recall, had been brought over from China by the monk Eisai about 2 centuries prior. It gained enough popularity that Japanese of the Nambokcho period enjoyed engaging in something called tocha, literally fighting tea, which was the practice of gambling on someone's ability to distinguish different tea varieties by taste alone. An overarching
I would be so bad at something like this.
Cultural trend which defined the Nambokcho period was something called
give me, fighting monster energy, maybe I'll be good.
Basara, a word which describes a preference for loud and ostentatious displays of luxury, both in fashion and in decorative taste. The Basara trend was particularly visible among the samurai of this era, as many of them were new money families, so to speak, who had risen to prominence during the tumult of the early to mid 1300s. That being said, life was not all about gaudy opulence, as Zen Buddhism remained the preferred faith of the Bakuhu's top tier, with the Rinzai sect in particular achieving supreme status thanks to passionate support from the Bakuhu's first shogun, our old friend Ashikata Takauji. Zen would go on to play a major role in the culture of subsequent centuries, so Rinzai's establishment of its power base during this era was an important development. The next phase of Muromachi period culture was Kitayama culture, a phase which coincided with the early to mid 1400s, or in other words, the Muromachi Bakuhu's greatest period of stability and authority. Its name, Kitayama, comes from the region of Kyoto in which Ashikaga Yoshimitsu lived during his retirement. Kitayama culture sees the fiery and youthful Basara proclivities of the previous era begin to mellow out and shift toward an emphasis on harmony, and thanks to Yoshimitsu, it is also the phase when the aforementioned blending of warrior, aristocratic, and Zen Buddhist culture really begins in earnest. This is perhaps best exemplified by Kinkakuji, or the Golden Pavilion, which we discussed a bit on our last episode. Kinkakuji is a 3-story temple where the first story is built in the aristocratic Shinden-zukuri style of the Heian period. The second story is built in the Bukezukuri, or warrior style, of the Kamakura period, and the third story is built in the Chinese Zen style, which would have been in vogue around the time of the building's construction. Like his grandfather before him, Yoshimitsu strongly embraced the
Never realized there would be so much meaning to each floor or something like this. Interesting.
Rinzai sect of Zen, and he perfected a system of temple hierarchy which organized and ranked the country's Zen temples, with the temple of Nanzenji at its peak, and 5 of the top temples in each of Kyoto and Kamakura making up the elite layer just below it. This system allowed the Bakuhu to more effectively administer the country, as it could now use this network of great temples, as well as the many hundreds of smaller temples linked to them, to exert its influence on a widespread level. The importance of the country's Zen temples to the Bakuhu's administration was a key link in allowing elements of Chinese Zen to really begin coloring Japanese culture, as many of the monks inhabiting the temples at the top of Yoshimitsu's hierarchy in Kyoto and Kamakura were either visitors from China or individuals who had spent time studying abroad there. In addition to the aforementioned Zen architectural style, which we can see in the Golden Pavilion, a style of ink-wash painting called Suibokura, which aimed to express Zen's ideal spiritual state, also rose to major prominence.
Like, that's the kind of painting I want in my room, This really looks awesome. The way they're looking over this kind of, maybe it's just a field, but it looks like the sea of fog. I don't know if I'd call this Zen. To me, it looks a bit like scary, right? It looks like this endless, just, human-sized sea of fog.
Perhaps the most famous Muromachi period painter of this style was the monk Josetsu, an immigrant from China who is often referred to as the father of Japanese ink painting. Beyond the world of visual art, academics in general flourished within the Zen temples of this era, and a great number of monks were called upon to serve as secretaries or political and diplomatic advisors to the Bakuhu. In the secular world, well, kind of in the secular world, the now world-famous brand of Japanese theater known as No emerged onto the cultural stage for the first time. No traces its roots back to a pair of entertainment forms called Sarugaku and Dengaku, traditional performance arts involving a variety of elements such as dance, mimicry, acrobatics, comedy, and theatrical skits, typically performed as part of religious ceremonies. No evolved by specifically plucking the dance and theater elements out of these older art forms, and in its early days it was often performed as a means to raise money for temple construction and repair. With the backing of said temples, No performers eventually became able to form guilds and create professional theater troupes, with the most prominent being the 4 Sarugaku troops of Yamato. No, by the way, continued to be referred to as Sarugaku until the Edo period, which is why these troops were referred to as Sarugaku troops rather than No troops. One of these troops, the Kanzei troop, was led by the actor and musician Kagami, and he and his son, Zeami, would become prominent enough to receive the direct patronage of Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, allowing them to fully invest themselves in elevating No to the status of high art. They were responsible for writing many of the most famous No plays, and Zeami would also go on to write several important treatises such as the Fushikaden, or Teaching on Style in the Flower, and the Kakyo, or A Mirror Held to the Flower, both of which outline not only Zeami's thoughts on No and acting, but also on aesthetics and life in general. The final phase of Muromachi
sounds like the kind of stuff I'd love to, well, learn about the more daily life of this kind of entertainer in that time period.
Culture is known as Higashiyama culture, with its name coming from the location in which the 8th shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, built his residence following the end of the Onin War in 1477. It was in this phase that the artistic preferences of the preceding eras at last reached their apex of refinement and maturity, with the famous Japanese concepts of wabi-sabi, the expression of beauty through simplicity and imperfection, and yugen, deep, mysterious profundity, coming to the fore as a result of the spread of Zen sensibilities. This phase saw a decline in interest in cultural imports from the mainland and a renewed attraction for more uniquely domestic trends. However, as this phase of Muromachi period culture will largely be the one which colors the world of our next video's topic, the Sengoku period, I think it's best that we leave the exploration of its details and the restrained, refined beauty which it somehow birthed within a world of unparalleled chaos and warfare for next
It's gonna get insane. Absolutely insane.
And with that, my friends, we have managed to hit most of the main points of the complex.
That is it. Feels bad again. This is the last Bioden video we'll watch for now. Okay, that was great. I actually really enjoyed the section about the common people and then the culture and the art. I thought that was really interesting. Maybe there was less to talk about in the previous period, but I kind of wish he had gone on to that in the previous period too. I mean, I'd be able to go back eventually if I want to. But yeah, mighty interesting. Again, we skipped the Onin War, which I guess we will be told about in next time in the Shogunate videos. I believe one of the early episodes is about the Onin War. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, the second episode. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Some Japanese people say we have wabi-sabi, a beautiful idea. There's no longer wabi-sabi. Okay. But yeah, again, Muromachi is really interesting. I mean, it's definitely short, but it feels obviously very linked to the Kamakura period. They're very similar in a way. A lot of interesting character, a lot of war, conflict, backstabbing, political machination, a lot of crazy stuff, that's for sure. But I enjoyed it. Yeah, very dense period, but very interesting. Amazing video. Oh, my keyboard is in US style. Amazing video. Okay, well, once again, that was the only one I wanted to watch today, as next time we'll start the Sengoku Jidai proper. And again, it's gonna take many streams, I think, because we have 80 plus videos in my Sengoku Jidai playlist from the Shogunate. They really seem to cover everything in depth. Every battle, every probably political event, I assume. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it again. I'm really gonna learn about the Sengoku Jidai to the max. hopefully it's gonna be very interesting. But yeah, that will be it for today. Once again, hope you guys enjoyed the reaction. Tell me if you have any videos you'd like me to watch about any parts of Japan's history. It's always possible I can go back eventually. Hello Nubik, sorry to say you came at the end. But yeah, next week we start the Sengoku Jidai, and yeah, it's gonna be something. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe, and see you guys next time, and tomorrow's Sunday stream. I'll see you guys there too. See you.